much, David, for taking the time to talk to us ahead of EduFest. We're just under a year away from our fourth edition of the International Festival of Education. You've attended before, but next time you'll be back on campus, it will be as a speaker. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you. I'm thrilled, excited to be coming back again, actually, and speaking. Yeah, thank you so much. Wonderful.
Some people may recognize you, some people may not. Would you like to start maybe by telling us a little bit about who you are, what your job title is, and what that entails?
I'm David Porritt. I'm a Doctor of Education, and my main role is as the principal of Budapest British International School, which is an IB continuum school. It's the only IB continuum school in Budapest, actually, and the first ever in Hungary to get the IB continuum and have students go on to university, which we're really proud of that. And I have to say the team are brilliant, so it's credit to them. The second role is, along with being a principal, is that I am still a director of Karen Ardley Associates, which is a professional development leadership coaching company based in the UK. I was for a while full-time consulting with the company. And then, well, perhaps we'll come on to it a bit later, but given the pandemic and then what happened then, and people couldn't do consulting. So I was very lucky and was invited back into to be a principal. And then the third area, which is actually going to form most of what we're looking into at EduFest, is that I set up a podcast with a friend of mine 2 years ago as a New Year resolution. We were chatting and said, hey, come on, let's learn something. And I said, well, I'd just love to have a podcast. And he said, oh, I want to do one as well. What do you want to do it about? And we're like, well, to be honest, I just like listening to people and their stories. So we called it Leading Stories, and that's the podcast. And we're going to use a lot of that in the workshop at the EduFest.
I'd be really curious to get a better sense of how you found yourself in the profession of education, firstly. And then secondly, maybe if you can tell us a little bit about what was it a specific moment, or was it a series of events that led you to kind of focus on the story side of leadership and on the learnings from those stories rather than let's go with maybe a more theoretical approach. Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's start with the first part of that very good question. What got me into education in the first place? Well, I think if we go back to when I was at school, at the same age of as the students at La Rose in the secondary school, I was, how should we say this? I knew the headmaster very well, mostly for the wrong reasons, but I knew him well, and he and another senior teacher still invested in me. They believed in me, and in fact, one of them said, "Look, instead of messing around, why don't you help out in a local primary school every Wednesday afternoon? They're doing sport. Why don't you go along there, get involved?" And I went along thinking, oh, fair enough. And the first hour, I loved it. I thought, wow, this is brilliant working with young children, playing football, playing basketball. It was just brilliant. And I thought, oh, if I could do this, I could really. Oh, sorry, I got someone calling me now. I could become a teacher. And so that was really what I thought about. And then when I realized that I could get the A-level grades that I thought I would need and still not have to do that much work, because I was playing a lot of music at the time and I was in bands, and I also had kind of ambition to be a rock star. And then when I went to university, I realized that I wasn't good enough or cool enough or good looking enough to become a rock star. And so I thought, well, I'll stick with being a teacher. And you actually, if you realise, don't you, when you're in a primary school, if you can play the guitar and the keyboards and you're reasonably okay at football, to the children, you are a bit of a rock star. so I used to say to sometimes to people when I first started teaching, they'd say, what do you do for a living? I say, I'm a professional footballer. So, because I play football and I get paid. Well, that's professional, isn't it? Or I'm a professional musician. I was a proper professional musician at one time. So that was kind of how I got into it. And then as I got interested in learning at university, I became absolutely ridiculously obsessed with learning about how people learn. And I got really interested in schools as institutions. And I was lucky. I had some brilliant mentors, and in the 1980s, mentors who encouraged me and gave me opportunities. And I went from being basically disinterested in learning to reading everything I could read and joining in everything I could possibly join in with, writing musicals, playing sport, getting into leadership, thinking about stuff. And I remember being quite arrogant, actually. I think some people, my wife might say I'm still a bit arrogant, but that's a conversation for another day. I remember saying to my friends at university, I'm going to be ahead by the time I'm 30, right? And they're like, well, don't be stupid. Anyway, I really worked hard. And I was appointed as a head teacher as a 30-year-old, but it was about a month before I became 31. So kind of just about made it. And then, and that got me basically into being a school leader. And I've been doing that all around the world internationally since 1997. And I think you learn a lot through that process, and that kind of leads to the second part of the question, really, which is about why stories and not theory. Well, I have a doctorate in educational leadership, so I do know a fair bit about the theory. And what I think you start to realize when you do a professional doctorate is that you have your own story. You have something to share that's unique to you. Other people have had similar experiences, but the meaning they've drawn from that is different. So I got really interested in how is it that some people are incredibly successful over a long period of time in a context and move somewhere else and they're not. What's happened? How is it that some people seem to be amazing storytellers, and that power of storytelling becomes a currency of leadership influence? And how come? What can we do to learn more about that? So I kind of like theory, but what I like is a theory of practice more than just theory. And I like thinking, okay, well, if that's a theory, how might that system or that understanding help us in this context? And how can I then think about telling a story that gets people excited about it?
Would it be a fair summary then, or assumption that your EduFest session will focus more on stories than theory?
Yes, I hope so. Although I would expect myself as an IB educator and in an institute of learning to be saying, look, this is a kind of theoretical perspective, but here's some practical applications. Or actually, what we've seen is here's the practical applications. And if we've drawn a theory out of that, maybe these principles could be useful to you in your context. Because we know, don't we, that if you just copy a practice and you take it from one setting to another, there's a really good chance it's not going to be very good.
Right.
But if you think about the principle behind it, then it will be. So I remember, for example, last year at EduFest, talking to some of the students in the kind of foyer area. And what was particularly noteworthy was not just what they were doing, but the passion they had for their school and for one another, and for the sense of commitment and agency they showed for the event. So I came back to my school and thought, how well are we doing in relation to that? How could we get our students to be even more committed to each other and show more agency? And what opportunities are there for them to do more here at Budapest British International School as a principle rather than copy the practice? So that, to me, that's a kind of narrative, a sort of story.
Would it be then fair to say that attendees will be able to walk away with not just a wider understanding, but maybe also some hands-on experiences and opportunities for them to do exactly that? Kind of how do you transpose? It's not about copying and recopying, but how do you then contextualize it, and how do you modify and adapt it to your own context and to your own possibilities and own schools, essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly sense that. In fact, just think back to, it's 15 years ago that I trained as an adult learning facilitator with the National College. And I learned a lot about how to not be a primary school or secondary school teacher when you're working with adults. And the adults come with their own meanings. They come with their own need to learn to understand what's happening and why it's happening in a way that young children don't really. I mean, you can walk into one of my 8-year-old classes and I could say to them, we're going to do the best thing we've ever done today. And they go, great. And they've no idea what it is. But you rock up with your staff and you say, guys, I've got this really fantastic thing we're going to do. It's going to be great. And they're all looking at you thinking, let's don't do that. So it's different. But I think most of the stuff that I want to cover in the session comes from the podcast that we set up and what we've learned by listening to what we describe as under-celebrated leaders. So one of those right early on actually was a guy who was a Paralympian. And one of the key messages that came out of that was if you're not all on the same page in relation to your vision and your goal, then you're not on the same page, which means you must be on different pages. And that's therefore really problematic and difficult. So let's think about how we can get onto the same page. What could you do to understand the extent to which you're on that? Educators are really good at reflecting on themselves. Sometimes they do it in a way where they dismiss their strengths unhelpfully, perhaps. But superpower reflection, that goes with it. So I think we'll look into a little bit about ways that you can reflect on yourself in a healthy way, which then connects into two theoretical things. One is what we would call a ladder of accountability. And the second would be the idea of rather than looking at problems, but looking at polarities. And that comes from some work from 30 years ago, but it's a really interesting way of trying to understand that it's just too simplistic to say, here's a problem, let's find a solution. Schools are not like that. They're really, really complex. And you might have two competing demands, maintaining a financial position, but equally not losing any sense of quality of learning and teaching. How do you balance those two competing things? What's the understanding that comes from that?
If you don't think about the story, what happens then?
The notion is that everyone has a story to tell or multiple stories. If you don't create scope and space and a climate in which people can tell their stories in an organization, then you don't benefit from them. You don't learn from them, and they keep them internally. And it may well be that they're frustrated that they've got something really important to say, but no one's giving them a chance to say it. So I think there's a real importance that we've learned through the podcast of giving people an opportunity to tell their story and listen for what you can learn from it.
It makes me think you must be incredibly busy as the head of school. On top of that, you've got your podcast. Evidently, reflection is a superpower, so I imagine you do a lot of that also. At
Yes.
what point do you disconnect, or are your different aspects of your life so intertwined that when you're not doing one, you're doing the other anyway? And so that's why the podcast is a bit of a hobby. But is there anything else that you do in your quote unquote downtime, if you even have any? Any books that got you onto this path that you would like to recommend to somebody? And as a former musician also, I mean, the rock star that you still are, any musical instrument that you still play and practice?
Well, that's a lot of questions. Right, let's think about how to answer those. It's like a symphony, isn't it, really? Unfolding in front of us. I've learned the hard way through suffering from clinical burnout quite some time ago to look after myself better. I wouldn't say I'm very good at it. I know I'm not, but I'm better than I was. And I'm good enough to be able to manage the competing demands for pretty much most of the time. I love my job. I love schools generally. I just absolutely love being in a school. It is brilliant. Nothing is ever the same. It's just wonderful. So I never have any trouble coming into work because I just love being here. And the podcast, I work with a friend of mine in the UK, and we tried to record about 10 shows, and it'll take us about 5 months to do that when we have free time. And it's always Sunday evening. It takes 45 minutes to do a show. It takes longer to find people and prepare them. And then he does the editing because he's got a bit more time on his hands than I do, and he does that, and then it goes out when we've got 10 shows. Then we do a season. So we're recording the autumn season at the moment, and that'll start in September. um and then, well, that's what was the else you were asking about? Music
Any
and
music
book.
and any reading? Yeah.
Well, I play keyboards and guitar. I understand the keyboard. I played to quite a high level professionally. Um, and I love playing the guitar, particularly the electric guitar, just because it is cool. I mean, I love them. They look cool. They sound cool. You can be in my study. I can play some, Scorpions or some AC/DC tracks or some modern praise and worship. I'm playing at our church this weekend. So it's just great. I love it, and it's a stretch. I have to really work hard at that, whereas the keyboard is fairly straightforward, really. In fact, you asked me earlier, what have I got a song on repeat? And I do at the moment, actually. Came across a wonderful song by Justin Hayward, who was in the Moody Blues, called "Broken Dream." It's about loss, really, and I came across it because recently my father passed away, and it was about some months ago, and trying to work through the grief of that loss. This song, I listened to it, it spoke to me, it made me weep. So I don't want to get too emotional now, but that is on repeat, and I just found it healing and soothing, and it's a beautiful song. It's not heavy rock at all. It's just beautiful. So I do listen to that, and listen to a lot of rock, choral music, jazz, funk, progressive. Depends what mood I'm in. And sometimes I listen to a whole album. I got into that a few years ago, rather than just a song. It's things like Spotify, which has saved my life. I think you can listen to songs that you like, and that's great. But I think sometimes it's just really great to take an artist and listen to the album in the way that they wanted it to be listened to. So I'll this weekend, I think I can feel Rush's Permanent Waves coming on. It's one of my favorite. If I was going to recommend a book to somebody, I think it's probably three, if I might have that. The first would be The Seven Habits, which is Stephen Covey's book, which I think so many people have read that and found it useful to them and helpful. The second book would be Ordering Your Private World by Gordon MacDonald, which is really about ordering your private world. It's a good title, right? And then the third would be the letter of James, which is in the New Testament. And as a Christian, that's been a letter that it's a book in the Bible essentially, but it was a letter, we think, that's really covers some really important practical truths about how to be a great helper and a great servant to communities, and how to look after people.
You make me think of something, and maybe we'll finish with this. You seem to have found in your childhood, through perhaps trouble, or being often in trouble,
Yeah.
you seem to have found a value and worth in the effort, in the connection, in the creativity, in the physical activity also of hard work. Would you say that we live in a world today where perhaps it is more difficult to find both the time and the balance to be able to pursue a creative endeavor because we're so focused on the result and we're thinking that, well, if I like to paint a little, let's say, I'm not going to take the time to sit in front of my easel and paint because what's the outcome there? What am I getting out of it? Would you say that that's a symptom of our day and age?
Yeah, it could well be. Although I can't remember a day and age when we haven't been really busy. Before we had emails, I remember used to sit on the. I don't know why was it that we had every people had telephones in their hallway in their house. It would be cold and a bit dark, and that's where your phone was. And it was on a cable, right? A big windy one. That's where our phone would be. So the phone would ring, I would have dinner, the phone would ring. So you stop eating, you go and take the phone call, and you'd be there 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I used to sit on the bottom step of the staircase, and then I'd go and have my dinner, and it was gone cold, right? And then I'd spend the whole evening on the phone to people. or ringing me up and asking me about stuff or work stuff or church stuff or football or whatever it might be, cycling, whatever. And then we got emails, didn't we? And I'm old enough to remember getting my first ever email, and I printed it out and gave it to my secretary, and she typed up something and then gave it back to me, and I sent it to someone. And today, now it's 120 a day, isn't it? It's like, and we've moved to a system where we're on 24/7 and you can connect. So I think to me, it's not about managing time. It's about managing energy, because everyone has the same time. It's actually, really, if you think about it, it's the only resource that everyone has exactly the same. And the day's the same length for me as it is for you and everybody who comes to EduFest. So the question must be, what do we do with the time, and how can we protect it for ourselves? How can we utilize it for what gives us a sense of restoration? So here's an example. Tomorrow morning, I'll get up, I'll walk around my garden, I'll have a coffee, and it's quite hot here in Hungary. So by about 7, I'll be on my road bike and I'll do 50 kilometers. And that's my me time. And that's where I think about stuff. And I come back and I've processed, some mistakes I made this week, and that moment when I was just a little bit flippant and I shouldn't have been. And I want to think it through and work out what the triggers were and so on. And then I'll play my guitar and I'll see some friends, and we're going to watch, I think we're going to the new Mission Impossible movie and try to do some normal things. And then there's work involved. So what I've found is that if I make a decision about what the order I do stuff during the weekend, then it doesn't feel like work. If I'm being overly directed in some way, then it does feel like work. So I've learned to take work and make it enjoyable by choosing what I do when I do it.